Hi and welcome to this video. So in the previous video, what we did was we essentially went over refactoring our interrupt function called create React class, which this was a hook into the create React class module that we imported into our project. And this was a fallback solution because we weren't able to use the .js interrupt solution to hook into ES6 classes. Now, although this works, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this approach if you wish to use React.js in your Dart projects. So what I would recommend is in the form of a package called React. And what this does is it essentially wraps React.js and it exposes a much friendlier API for working with React. So in fact, we can create a component that extends a component and use a render function in this fashion. So essentially, the syntax is quite similar to ES6. So in this video, we're going to be using this package and we're going to go over the examples on the home page here using the React package. So we're going to start by installing this package. So if we look at the installation instructions over here, we just need to add this to our pubspec.yaml file and then we'll run pub-get. So let's do that now. So our pubspec.yaml file is here, and then we'll just add this here as a dependency. We'll save it, and then I can run, well, in fact, instead of running pub-get, I'm using the Dart extension for Visual Studio Code, which automatically runs pub-get for me. So I'll wait till it's finished. Okay, so now that it's finished, if we go back to the instructions, we can import it in that way. But also, what we need to do is we need to go to our index.html file and import React and React DOM. So installing the React package, it comes with a pre-packaged version of React and React DOM. So at the time of this recording, it's React version 15. So I'm essentially going to copy this, and I'll come back to this index.html file, and then I will replace these two, React and React DOM, with it. So I'll start by pasting that there, and then I'll save everything, and yep, there we go. Okay, so let's continue. So now that we've got these two packages in here, I'm going to leave this here, and everything else should be fine. And let's see whether we can rewrite our component using the React Dart package. So I will start by commenting this out, and then at the top here I'll import our React package, so React.dart. And then instead of doing create React class, we can do class take a component, extends component. And then what we need to do is we need to implement our render function, but before that, let's do our get initial state, which returns a map. So what I can do here is can return a map object, which has got our number of seconds set to 0. Oops, sorry. And then let's override our component did mount. And in here, what we'll do is we'll create an interval property here. So I'll call it interval. And this is of type timer. So here we can do interval equal, interval equal timer dot periodic. And we set our duration to 1 second. And then in our callback, we'll call a tick function. So now let's define this tick function. And in this tick function, what we'll do is we will call setState. And now, of course, setState comes from this component class. And then we'll define a function called state. And in this function, we will return a map whereby we'll define our new number of seconds, and it will be state seconds, which is a number plus 1. Okay, and now what we need to define is our component will amount. So let's override, and then we do component will amount, and in here we cancel our interval, cancel that way. And then we need to define our render function. So override that, render function will return a div. And then in here it says, okay. And then the text will be seconds. And then our number of seconds. Okay. And once we've defined our component and the methods, we will we need to register this ticker component. So I'll call it ticker, and then we call a top level function called register component, which takes in a closure, and we just need to return a new instance of ticker component. So this should do it for us. If I save this, and then what we need to do is to come to our main.dart. Of course, we get a problem now, because what we need to do is import 2 libraries. So there is React client, and then there is React DOM. So what we need with React client is essentially to call a function called set client configuration. So we need to invoke this first, and then afterwards we can render our component. So our component, we called it ticker. So essentially we create a new instance and we'll pass in an empty object. And then we need to define our context for our render function. So we'll do query selector, and then output 2. So now we don't need this one. And if I save, wait till page reloads again, we should have a working solution. And then we're getting an error, so let's see what this error is. All right, in fact, we're supposed to be looking at this error message. So it says set state expects its first parameter to either be a map or a transitional set state callback. So let's see what we're doing with our set state in our tick function. So set state dynamic. All right, takes a dynamic object with our new state. So we should be able to just do that instead. And let's wait for it to reload. Okay, that's good. Okay, so we can get rid of that now. Let's reload again. Okay, that seems to be working. So that means we can get rid of all of that and this too. So let me save this. So yeah, this looks a whole lot cleaner here compared to the previous example. And if we go back to our main.dart file, we've imported these two libraries, React client, because we need to set client configuration before we proceed to render anything onto the screen. So in fact, let me do this instead. So I'll call it React client, and then I can do React client dot set client configuration, and here I'll do React DOM, and then I'll do React DOM dot render. If I save and reload, yep, the example still works. Okay, so back to the second example, or the third example rather, the documentation. So this is the example of the to-do app. So whereby we see an input field and a button, and we can add items and so on and so forth. So let's see what we can do here. Okay, so there are two components, to-do list and a to-do app component. So let me start by creating a new component, and I'll call it to-do app dot, and in here we'll import our React package, and then what do we need to do? So we'll create our to-do app. We'll create to-do app, and the state object takes in items, just an array, and then it takes in a text param, and then the render function. Okay, so I'm going to, well, let's do this one first. All right, so I'll create a to-do app component that extends component, and then I'll create an override for get initial state, essentially, and then I'll return an object containing items, which is an array, and in fact, yeah, which is an array, and then there was yeah, text, which is an empty string. So that's the first thing we'll do, and the second thing we need to do is define our render function. with this structure. So I'm going to copy this just to save me going back and forth, and I'm going to place it here, and I'll comment this out. So now I can define my render function, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially build out this structure. So it starts with a div, so we can do div essentially. This doesn't have any attributes. I'll put an empty object, and then it takes in all of these children, which we pass in a list here, and then in this list we'll define our children. So the first item in here is a heading 3 element that takes no properties, and then it basically just takes to do as a string. So if it's just a string value, we can pass in a string. Of course, if it's other elements, we can pass in an array. Okay, so let me proceed to the next one is a to-do list component. We've not created that yet, so for now I'll just do to-do list. There we'll define that later on, followed by a form here, and then it's got an attribute here called onSubmit, and this attribute invokes a handle submit method, which we need to define. So I'll just define that here quickly. So handle submit. Okay, and then this form takes in a list of children. So we pass in an array as the second argument. And in here would be, start with a label. In fact, let me speed this up because I think you kind of got the gist of what's happening. So label takes in a HTML4. Okay, so here's the full structure we have, and let's see if we can get this rendering out onto the page. So in order to do that, we need to register our component, do app, and then I'll call register component, which takes in a closure and then returns a new instance of to-do app component. Okay, so now what we need to do is to go to our main.dart file, and then we'll render this component, but we need to import it in first. So let's import this component. We called it to do app.dart, and then create a new instance of that, and it doesn't take in any parameters, so we pass in an empty object, and we need to give it a DOM node for it to be rendered in. So we called it, well, we're going to call it output 3, and this doesn't exist yet, so I'll go to my index.html, and then let's define it here. So let's save all our files and wait for the page to reload, and let's see what we get. And yeah, we have something being rendered, so it's working so far. And of course we get this warning message. Each child in an array or iterator should have a unique key prop. And this is a common issue with React itself. React requires that each of these items we've added in our array should have a key prop defined. So I'm not going to define it in this example, but if you wish to, you can define a key prop and probably, you know, put something like datetime.now or something like that. In fact, let me just do an example just with this one. So you could probably just do something along the lines of datetime.now and then milliseconds since epoch. So you could do something along these lines, which should generate a separate key for each of these. But just for the sake of this example, I'll leave this out. Feel free to do that if you wish. Okay, and second thing we need to do is to define our to-do list component. So if we go to the documentation and you look at our to-do list component, it looks like that. So it simply extends React component and it's got a render method returning this. So let's do this quickly before we proceed. So let's do class to-do list component extends component, and let's define our render function, which will return an unordered list from the example. So let's see what this looks like. Okay, so it gives us an unordered list, takes in no parameters, and then takes in a list here. So what we can do here is we can, in fact, instead of passing in a list, we can do props items. So we'll pass in a list of items, and then we can map over those items, and then with each item, or I'll call it to do, we will return a list item. So in this list, the key is set to our to do, then the ID property, and then the text in here would be to do dot text. And then after this mapping is done, this map returns an iterable type, so we need to convert it to a list that way. And then to use this component, we need to register it. So I'll call it to-do list, and let's register our component. To-do list component. Okay, so doing this should now allow us to instantiate it in here, and it's to-do list with a capital L, and we need to pass in our items. So our items is state, then items. And then so one thing I wish to do, in fact, is just cast it to a map. So each item in the list will be a map, which has a string as the key and then a dynamic type for the value. I'll just do that. Okay, so now what I am going to proceed to do, or what we need to do, is to define our handle submit and handle change functions, because at the moment, if I type something here, and I click add one, nothing is essentially happening and the page is redirecting. So let's start by in our handle submit function, we'll capture the event, and then we need to cast this to a synthetic form event. It's called, so which this extends a synthetic event class. So this comes up as part of the React package. So we cast it to that, which now allows us to call the prevent default function. So if I save this, and then I type something in here, nothing happens. The page doesn't refresh, so that's good because of that. Okay, and now we need to implement our handle change. So let's see, well, not a handle change, the full submit functionality. So let's see what's happening in here. So it does a if prevent default, checks if the text is empty, and then it will just return else. We'll create a new item and add it to our list of items. So let's see what that looks like for us. So in here, we need to check state.text is empty. So if it's empty, we just wish to return. Else, we will create a new item whereby the ID we'll do datetime.now milliseconds since epoch, and then for the text it will be our state text, and then after that we will invoke our set state function, which takes in our new state object, and our items will be essentially our let me go back here. So I'll do items. I'll have our state items, and then I'll add this new item. This new item here. But calling add returns void, so I'm going to use the cascade operator, and then I can just do items here, and then I will reset our text to an empty string. So let me save this and let's give that a go. Okay, let's see, we're getting a no such method invocation error. Right, so in fact we need to pass in a synthetic event here, and I'll do in fact I'll make a synthetic form event, and let me save this and see if that sorts out our issue. Okay, so nothing is working because we need to update our state when we interact with that input field. So set state, our text would be the value our input field. So let's try this. And if I type in here, yeah, there we go. If we add, of course, nothing happens. So I figured out what this error is, no such method error, which is because in fact, if we look at the stack trace, it tells us where it's at. So to do app dot on line 52, which the culprit is this is dot text. So essentially we're trying to invoke a getter to a text property on the to do map object, which doesn't exist because by default this to do is set as a dynamic type. So if we did map, in fact we would have got a red line telling us that the getter text isn't defined for our class map. So we can fix that by doing that, and that should solve our problem. So let's wait till page reloads, and let's see if that solves our problem. And it does. Brilliant. So let's clear our logs and try one more time. If I reload screen and then type finish tutorial, I click add. Okay, that's perfect, that works. So yeah, the problem was literally just this bit. Okay, but then I will advise at this point that is helpful. It's always good to specify the type whenever possible, because if dynamic is everywhere, it does increase the amount of errors that you'll be getting in your code. So whenever you can specify the actual type, just do that. It will help you in the long run. Anyway, I do need to clarify that we are using the cascade operator. So we're using double period here, and what this double period does is it allows us to invoke this method, but then once this whole expression is evaluated, it will return our list. Else if I do that, the result will be void. So this will be a void, it wouldn't be a list anymore. So it's something just to look out for. So it's 2 periods, not 1. So when I save that, it gives me that. Or alternatively, we could simply just do this instead. Items, and we could do items.add. So this would also work. Finish tutorial. You can see it's added it on there. So either approach works, but I prefer the shorter version. So let me undo that and leave it at this one. So what we need to do is to look at this example. So in this last example, we are building a Markdown editor. So I guess it's got some text, and then what we need to be able to do is to amend this Markdown, which will affect the full output. So let's see what we can do. So I'm going to come back to this file, and then I'm going to create a new file, and then we'll call it Markdown editor. So this will contain our Markdown editor component, and we need to import the React package, and then create our Markdown editor component, and then we need to override the render function. So I'll come back here and I will copy the markup here, and I'll place it here. So again, I'm going to speed this up while I build out the structure. Okay, so now that we've defined our React element tree, we need to register this component. And then we return Markdown editor component. Okay, and then let's try and render this out onto the screen. So I'll come back here to main.dart, and then we import Markdown editor, and create our instance here. Let's use output 4 for this one. So we'll come back to our index.html, and then we'll create output 4. So let's save all of this, and then yeah, there we go. And let's clean this up slightly. So after the label, after this label, I am going to insert a breaker tag just to shift the text area to the next line. Okay, so what is left to do is for us to type in some text, and then we should see the output here being rendered. Alright, so let's see what the documentation is doing. Yeah, so we can see that the documentation is okay. So it's using a library. It seems called Remarkable. So we need to import that into our project, and then from this library, it's calling the render function. Yeah. So even before we do this bit, let's just handle the set state when the handle change function gets called. So if I come here in handle change, I'll just do my set state. Well, before I do my set state, let's define our initial state. So get initial state, and we want to return a map which contains a value property. So this one essentially. Then I'll wrap this in a string. So let's see what this looks like right now. We should see this being rendered in here. And okay, seems to be working. Let me make sure. I'll save that. Okay, cool. That works. So now what we need to do is call set state, and then we update the value to e.target.value. Okay. So before we implement this, we need to import the Remarkable package into our project. So I am going to go to cdn.js, and once I'm on cdn.js, we will search for the Remarkable package. Okay, cool. So we got that here. So I'm going to copy the script for that, and then if we come back here and we go to our index.html file, we'll place it right here. So I can save this. And then what we need to do is to essentially interoperate with this Remarkable library. So in our interop folder, we'll create a new file, and then we'll call it remarkable.dart. Okay, so in order to know what what to do, we need to understand the Remarkable API. So looking here at the documentation, it looks like we can create a new instance from it, and then this instance contains a render method which takes in a single argument. So let's define our interrupt. By starting with the JS annotation, we need to give this file a library name, so we'll call it Remarkable interrupt. And then we need to import the JS package. And then we define a hook to the Remarkable class, so Remarkable. And then we define an external getter for the render function. So I'll just call it a function that way. So let's save this. And then if you go back to our Markdown editor, we'll import our interrupt file. So if I go back to interrupt, then remarkable.dart, and then with our get role markup, we can create a new instance of this. So md remarkable, create a new remarkable instance, and then we are returning a map whereby our HTML is defined as md.render, and then we are passing in our value. I believe that's what we need. Yep, that seems to be working. So if I get rid of this and I put an underscore, yeah, we can see that it's being rendered. So yeah, we've got our example working. Okay, awesome. So just to recap what we've done for this last example, we created a new file under web/components called a Markdown editor after the name of our component. We created a Markdown editor component, extending component. We've defined our initial state, which is essentially a value property. And then we created our tree structure of React elements, and then which has a text area, and then the default value is our value in our state. So what we are doing here is we've got a change event listener, whereby once we type into our text area, it updates the value here. Of course, when we call set state, this React element tree is redrawn again, which in turn means that this markup accepts the updates we made to our value property on the state, and then it converts the markdown into HTML. And after all of that, we just register our component, and then in our main.dart file, we are rendering this component in a DOM node with an ID of output 4, and which is right here. Okay, so that's about it. Really, we've gone over the full examples of the documentation, so that means that our video ends here. So again, thanks for watching this series, and if this really interested you and you'd love to learn more about Dart, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell notification icon so that you are updated when new videos are released. As always, thank you for watching.